rain beat against the windows in sharp, rhythmic patterns, casting an eerie hush over the room. The large library was still and silent, save for the occasional crackle of a fire burning low in the hearth. The heavy oak bookshelves lined the walls, filled with dust-coated volumes that had long since stopped being read. There was a smell of old paper and wood, mixed with the faint hint of something that was off, something not quite right. And in the middle of the room, sitting on a plush armchair, was a body. Miss Marple stood at the entrance of the library, her small, wiry figure dwarfed by the grand space. Her sharp eyes took in the details with the precision that had earned her both admiration and suspicion over the years. The victim, a distinguished man in his 60s with greying hair and a well-maintained appearance, was slumped forward in the chair, a large silver dagger protruding from his chest. His name, Charles Forsyth, was well known in the area as an author of mystery novels. Ironically, though he had written about countless murders, he had never once managed to solve a real one himself. The dagger was curious. It wasn't just any knife, but a relic, ornately designed with intricate engravings that suggested it had some historical significance. Yet, it was not an item one would expect to find in a home like Forsyth's, especially not in a modern setting. It seemed both out of place and somehow symbolic, and there was the strangest part of all. There was no sign of struggle. The room had not been ransacked, and nothing appeared to have been disturbed. The windows were locked, and the ID doors had been bolted from the inside. Whoever had committed the murder had left without a trace. No fingerprints, no bloodstains, no signs of forced entry. It was as though the crime had simply happened. Miss Marple glanced at the group of people gathered near the far corner of the room. They all looked as though they had been waiting for something, someone. None of them seemed to be particularly distraught, though they wore various expressions of concern. There was Forsyth's wife, Eleanor, who stood stiffly by a bookcase, her face pale and her hands clenched together. Beside her was her son, Gregory, a young man with a nervous twitch to his movements, looking as though he might bolt at any moment. Then there was the butler, Henry, who had been with the family for years. He seemed as though he were in a state of shock, though his eyes never strayed from the body, studying it in an almost clinical way. And finally, there was the detective. Detective Harris, a man who seemed more intent on avoiding eye contact with Miss Marple than actually inspecting the crime scene. He had the air of someone who believed they were in charge, but Miss Marple knew better. She had seen that attitude before, in younger detectives, who thought they could solve the world's mysteries with their fancy theories and loud proclamations. "Miss Marple, I'm so glad you could come," Harris said, though the words seemed more out of obligation than genuine appreciation. "We're dealing with a strange case here. I'm certain you'll find that the answers are elusive." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes glinting behind her spectacles. "I always find that the more elusive a case seems, the more straightforward it becomes once the right pieces fall into place." The detective gave her a half-smile, but Miss Marple could tell he was not convinced. He gestured to the body, stepping aside to allow her a clearer view. "As you can see, everything is in place. No signs of forced entry, no obvious suspects. It's as if he simply sat down, waited for someone to stab him, and then expired. And that dagger, why would anyone use something so outlandish?" Miss Marple studied the scene carefully. The dagger was clearly the key, but not for the reason Harris thought. It wasn't just the weapon, it was the message it sent. The positioning of the body told her a great deal. Forsyth had been sitting there at ease when he was struck. He hadn't fought back or shown any sign of fear. In fact, Miss Marple realized his posture was almost too perfect for someone who had just been murdered. "I believe," she said slowly, "that Mr. Forsyth knew his attacker." Harris looked at her with a raised brow. "Do you?" "Yes," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "He didn't resist because he was not in danger. He must have recognized the person who killed him. But we've interviewed everyone in the house. None of them have any reason to harm him." Miss Marple ignored him and began pacing the room. The clues were there, small but significant. The strange positioning of the body, the lack of struggle, the oddness of the weapon, all these details spoke to something deeper, something Harris was not seeing. She turned to the group, her eyes scanning each one of them. "I'd like to ask a few questions," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Let's start with you, Mrs. Forsyth. Can you tell me where you were when your husband was murdered?" Eleanor Forsyth's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of breaking down. But then she composed herself, her hands folding into tight fists. "I was in my study," she replied, her voice brittle. "I hadn't heard anything unusual." "And you, Gregory?" Miss Marple asked, turning her gaze to the young man. "Where were you?" Gregory shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the floor and the body. "I was in my room. I didn't hear anything either." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Both of them were lying, or at least they were hiding something. She turned to the butler, Henry. "And you, Henry?" "I was cleaning the dining room," he said, his voice flat. "I didn't know anything had happened until I came in here and found Mr. Forsyth like this." The statements were consistent, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that consistency didn't always equate to truth. In fact, she suspected that in this case it was a smokescreen. Someone was hiding something. "There's something you're all not telling me," she said quietly. "But I won't press you just yet. I'll need a little more time to piece things together." She turned back to the body. There was no obvious reason why Charles Forsyth had been killed, nor any clear motive. But the dagger was a piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. It had to be, and Miss Marple would be the one to decode it. Miss Marple stood still, her eyes flickering back and forth across the library as she absorbed the scene. The rain outside had intensified, drumming heavily against the panes. The fire in the hearth crackled in a futile attempt to warm the room, but Miss Marple's attention was on the room's subtle cues, the details others missed, the ones that didn't quite fit. Her mind worked quickly, finding patterns where others saw only chaos. The group had grown quiet as they watched her. She could feel their uncertainty, their impatience bubbling just beneath the surface. Detective Harris, though, was trying hard to maintain the air of authority that had so far eluded him in this investigation. He hovered near the door, arms crossed, watching her movements with a sharp, almost resentful gaze. "Miss Marple," he said, finally breaking the silence, "I hope you're not overcomplicating things. We've already ruled out the obvious. No one here seems to have had a motive for murder." Miss Marple turned slightly toward him, her expression softening. "Motive is often the last thing you should focus on, Detective. The truth lies in the details, the ones that don't add up." Her gaze shifted back to the body, then swept across the room. And I think I've found one. The others looked at her, unsure of what she meant. Henry, the butler, shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor Forsyth's jaw tightened ever so slightly, her eyes darting to the floor. Gregory, meanwhile, looked stricken. Too stricken, Miss Marple thought. His reaction didn't match the calm demeanor of someone who had just lost a parent. There was an edge to his grief, a forced, theatrical quality. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" Harris asked, a hint of annoyance creeping into his voice. Miss Marple didn't immediately answer. Instead, she walked slowly toward the side table beside the chair where Forsyth's body had been found. There, she observed a small silver pocket watch resting carelessly on the table's edge. It was a curious detail. Forsyth had been a man of habit, precise and meticulous in his lifestyle. So why would he have left this watch there, just barely touching the edge as though it had been hastily placed? A man like him wouldn't have forgotten it. Her fingers hovered over the watch, but she didn't touch it yet. She moved instead to the small stack of books beside it. Books that, upon a closer inspection, seemed oddly arranged. A few volumes from Forsyth's latest collection were out of place, as though someone had recently handled them and placed them back in a rush. Miss Marple noted the titles that weren't usually his. Historical novels, ones with old, worn covers, the kind of books Forsyth wouldn't have read for years. She turned, her gaze locking with Harris. "Tell me, Detective, who else has access to the library other than the family and the servants?" "The staff, of course, though I doubt anyone here would have any interest in reading Forsyth's books," Harris answered with a shrug. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And yet these books, these particular books, are quite unusual. Someone was looking for something in those pages, or perhaps they were hoping to hide something." Harris was now visibly perturbed. "Are you suggesting the staff had something to do with it? You're grasping at straws, Miss Marple." "No," she said quietly, "but someone in this room is. The staff may not have touched those books, but I believe someone here did. I just haven't yet figured out why." She stepped closer to the table, her keen eyes still fixed on the details. There, at the base of the chair, was a smudge of dark ink, barely noticeable against the dark wood floor. The smudge was too deliberate, too neat to be accidental. It hadn't smeared as one might expect, but instead had remained crisp and distinct, as though something, some object, had been pressed against it and then carefully removed. A clue, though subtle. Harris was still watching her closely. "Is there something you'd like to share, Miss Marple?" Before Miss Marple could answer, Gregory Forsyth shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the quiet that had settled over them all. He was looking at his mother, then back to the body, as if waiting for something to happen. His nervous energy felt off, too jittery for someone who had just lost a parent. I don't know what you're looking for, Miss Marple," he stammered, "but this is all ridiculous. It's all too much. My father was a great man. He didn't deserve this." His voice cracked on the word deserved, and Miss Marple caught the smallest flicker of something hidden in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. But something he was trying desperately to suppress. Eleanor Forsyth stepped forward then, her posture still rigid, but there was a slight tremor to her hands. "Please, don't try to suggest that my son had anything to do with it," she said, her voice steady, but tinged with an undertone of defensiveness. We've already been through this. I was in my study the whole time. I didn't hear anything, and neither did Gregory. You need to focus on the butler. He's the only one who has no alibi. Miss Marple's sharp gaze turned toward Eleanor, noting the small, almost imperceptible tremble in her voice, the way her lips quivered slightly. Miss Marple had dealt with enough nervous posturing to recognize it. Eleanor was defensive, too defensive. But then a shift occurred. Henry, the butler, had been standing quietly by the fireplace, his hands folded in front of him as though waiting for someone to notice him. Miss Marple had almost forgotten he was there. But now something about him caught her attention. The way his eyes flitted between the body and the others, never quite meeting anyone's gaze. It was a subtle thing, but in a room full of suspects. It was the smallest things that could lead to the truth. She took a step toward him. "Henry," she said softly, "how long have you been working for the Forsyth family?" Henry straightened, his face betraying nothing. "Over 20 years, Miss Marple. Long enough to know what I'm doing." "Of course," she said, her voice still gentle. "And you've seen many changes in that time, I imagine. But I wonder, did you notice anything strange on the night of Mr. Forsyth's death? Perhaps something out of place that might have caught your attention?" For the first time, Henry's composure faltered. Just for a moment, a flash of doubt crossed his face. He quickly regained control, but Miss Marple had seen it. The hesitation, the fear. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew. The truth was closer than ever. They were all hiding something, and it would only be a matter of time before the smallest of those hidden truths unraveled the whole mystery. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the library's grand space. Miss Marple, poised and deliberate, paced the floor as the others waited. Detective Harris had already begun his questioning in a way that seemed routine, but Miss Marple could sense the dissonance in the room, the quiet tension that had settled like an invisible weight. Each person's account was carefully crafted, each word measured, yet the cracks in their stories were beginning to show. She turned to Gregory Forsyth first, his fidgeting becoming more pronounced as he nervously adjusted the sleeve of his jacket. The young man's demeanor had struck Miss Marple earlier as erratic, and now, under her steady gaze, it was clear that he was more uncomfortable than he should have been. "Gregory," Miss Marple began, her tone soft yet probing, "you told me you were in your room when your father was murdered, but tell me, did you hear anything unusual coming from the library? Any sounds at all?" Gregory swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the floor. "No, nothing," he said too quickly, his voice rising a bit as though trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "Nothing at all. I was, reading. I didn't even know anything was wrong until my mother called me." Miss Marple's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "But you didn't hear the fire crackling or the storm outside? Surely the noise would have reached your room." Gregory shifted uncomfortably. I don't know. I wasn't paying attention to that. I was too focused on my book." Miss Marple allowed a brief silence to hang in the air, then spoke again, her voice quieter now. "You seemed very concerned when you arrived here, Gregory. Perhaps too concerned, for someone who hadn't even known his father was dead." Her eyes bored into his. "Why did you react the way you did when you first saw the body?" Gregory opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't speak. At once, Miss Marple noted the hesitation, the way his breath caught. I don't know," he said finally. though it was clear he wasn't being entirely honest. I was shocked. I didn't expect to see that. His face flushed, and he turned his gaze to the floor once again. Miss Marple let the silence stretch. Let the silence. His story didn't add up, and his eagerness to downplay the situation was telling. She had seen enough to know that he was trying to cover something. Whether it was guilt or fear, she couldn't yet say, but it was there, lurking just beneath the surface. She moved next to Eleanor Forsyth, whose unblinking gaze met hers with the cool, controlled expression of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of maintaining composure. Eleanor had spoken little so far, though her posture suggested an inner tension that was almost palpable. Mrs. Forsyth, Miss Marple began, her voice kind but firm. You said you were in your study when your husband was killed. Could you describe the exact moment you learned about his death? Eleanor's lips tightened, and she paused for a moment before speaking, as though carefully choosing her words. I was reading. I didn't hear anything unusual, but when I went to check on Charles... She faltered for a second, her voice thickening. I found him. Like that. Her eyes didn't waver as she said it, but Miss Marple noticed the subtle quiver in her voice, the way it caught ever so slightly at the word found. She hadn't heard it before, but Miss Marple knew. The tremor wasn't just grief, it was something else, something darker. Mrs. Forsyth, you seem remarkably calm for someone who just discovered a loved one murdered in cold blood, Miss Marple remarked, watching her carefully. May I ask how long you were in your study before you came to the library? Eleanor hesitated, and Miss Marple noticed the subtle tightening of her shoulders. The woman was already too practiced at hiding her emotions, but Miss Marple had learned to read even the smallest signs. I don't know. An hour, perhaps, Eleanor answered finally, but there was an odd lack of conviction in her tone. And the storm? Surely you must have heard it, Miss Marple continued. The rain was so heavy, and the wind was quite loud. How could you have been so immersed in your reading? Eleanor's composure slipped for a brief second, and she glanced toward the window as though seeing the storm for the first time. I suppose I was caught up in my thoughts, she said quickly, but Miss Marple knew better. The excuse was flimsy, a poor attempt to cover up the cracks in her story. Mrs. Forsyth, I don't believe you were in your study all that time, Miss Marple said gently, but with a certainty that made the woman stiffen. I think you left. Perhaps you saw something, heard something, something that made you return to the library. Eleanor's breath caught, her eyes briefly flicking to her son, who had been watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. I didn't hear anything, she repeated, though the conviction was missing. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, allowing the silence to fill the space between them. She then turned to the butler, Henry, who had been watching the proceedings quietly from the corner of the room. Henry, she began, her voice now calm and measured. I understand that you've been with the Forsyth family for many years. You must know them very well. Tell me, when you first discovered Mr. Forsyth, did you notice anything unusual? Henry blinked, his jaw tightening slightly at the question. No, Miss Marple. Everything was as it should be, he answered, his tone controlled. But there was something in his eyes that Miss Marple couldn't ignore, something that betrayed his calm facade. Really? Miss Marple asked, stepping closer to him. You didn't notice the misplaced pocket watch on the table, for instance? Beats the Mention of the watch seemed to cause a flicker of discomfort in Henry's expression. I don't recall," he murmured. His voice was slightly strained, and Miss Marple noted the subtle shift in his posture. He was avoiding her gaze, focusing on a distant corner of the room. "Henry," Miss Marple pressed, her voice unwavering. "It's not like you to overlook such details, especially in a case like this." He paused, and for a fleeting moment Miss Marple could see the tension in his face. Then, with a deep sigh, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to get involved, Miss Marple. It wasn't my place. That was all." But the way he said it, the weight of his admission, spoke volumes. He was hiding something important, something that went beyond simple loyalty to the family. Miss Marple turned away from him, considering what he had just implied. She'd expected that he would hide something, but not like this. The contradictions were mounting. Gregory's nervousness, Eleanor's controlled reaction, Henry's discomfort, and each of them had a piece of the puzzle, though none of them had yet revealed the full picture. As the room remained silent, Miss Marple felt the weight of their deception pressing against her, but she wasn't finished yet. No, she thought, they were only beginning to unravel. Soon she would have the answers, and when she did, she knew exactly where to look. Each lie had its own thread, and soon enough she would pull them all together. As the investigation deepened, Miss Marple's mind worked tirelessly, sifting through the web of lies, half-truths, and contradictions. Each suspect had a reason to be involved, and yet no single motive explained the entire picture. The situation was complex, a twisting maze of human emotions and frailties, each thread pulling in different directions. Greed, revenge, jealousy, and fear danced in the air like hidden daggers, but Miss Marple knew better than to rush to conclusions. She had learned long ago that when motives were tangled, the truth was often hidden in plain sight. The storm had not yet relented, and the heavy rain continued its relentless drum against the windows, as though reflecting the turmoil inside the house. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner of the library, watching her suspects, Gregory, Eleanor, and Henry, move about in various states of discomfort, each one hiding something more than they were willing to admit. Gregory was pacing now, his earlier nervousness giving way to a restless energy that suggested a mind on the brink of unraveling. He glanced toward the door as if waiting for something, or perhaps someone, but when Miss Marple's eyes met his, he quickly turned away, swallowing hard. There was a deep unease in him, something that had been festering long before the murder. The way he reacted when his father's death was first discovered, it didn't match the expected grief of a son who had lost a parent. His anger, the quickness with which he'd defended himself, all pointed to something hidden beneath the surface. Eleanor stood by the fireplace now, her gaze fixed on the flames, but her face was pale, tight with a tension that Miss Marple couldn't ignore. She had been careful, so very careful, in her words, but Miss Marple knew she wasn't telling the whole truth. The cracks in her alibi were too large to ignore, and the defensiveness that had emerged in her voice was telling. She had a reason to be protective, not just of herself, but perhaps of her son. There was something in the way she shifted when Gregory was mentioned, the slight, barely perceptible tension in her posture when he moved or spoke. It was as though she was trying to shield him from suspicion. The connection between them, however, subtle, was unmistakable. And then there was Henry, the butler, who had so far managed to keep himself in the shadows. blending into the background as he always had in the house. But his calm, collected demeanour had cracked ever so slightly when Miss Marple questioned him earlier. He had been hiding something. That much was certain. His nervousness wasn't the result of fear for his own safety. It was deeper than that. Perhaps it was loyalty to the family, or perhaps he had his own reasons for not wanting the truth to surface. The more Miss Marple thought, the more the pieces began to fall into place, but each one left a trail of unanswered questions. Why had Gregory reacted with such anxiety? Why had Eleanor seemed so distant, so careful in her responses? And Henry, why had he seemed so reluctant to speak? Miss Marple leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, her eyes narrowing as she watched the trio interact. The patterns were beginning to form, though the full picture remained elusive. There was a thread running through all of them, something tying them together. The more she listened, the more she saw the layers of deception. But what was the motive? What was the underlying force that had driven someone to kill Charles Forsyth? Gregory's voice broke the silence, his tone suddenly sharp and defensive. You all keep asking me about my father's death. Why aren't you questioning the others? He shot a quick, nervous glance toward his mother. My alibi is solid. I didn't leave my room. I had nothing to do with this. Miss Marple watched him closely. His defensiveness was almost too quick, a reaction that came from somewhere deep within, somewhere he didn't want to acknowledge. She could sense that he was hiding something, but what was it? I'm sure your alibi is solid, Gregory, Miss Marple said gently, but it's not just your movements that need to be questioned. It's your relationship with your father. Gregory stiffened at the mention of his father. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Miss Marple noticed the tremor in his jaw. What about it? He asked, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. I had nothing to do with him being dead. Miss Marple studied him for a moment, letting the silence stretch. Tell me, Gregory, how would you describe your relationship with your father? Was it one of mutual respect, or was there something else? Perhaps some unresolved tension? Gregory's eyes flickered with a brief flash of something, anger perhaps, or fear, but he quickly masked it. There was nothing, he said, sharply, though the tightness in his voice suggested otherwise. We had our disagreements, sure, but that's nothing unusual for a father and son, is it? Miss Marple didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned to Eleanor, watching her carefully. The way she was reacting to Gregory's outburst was telling. Eleanor's eyes darted between her son and Miss Marple, but there was a slight shift in her posture, a subtle, protective movement, almost as though she was bracing herself for the storm she knew was coming. Miss Marple had seen that look before, a mother's instinct to shield her child from harm, even if it meant protecting him from the truth. I think we both know there was more than just disagreement between Gregory and his father, Miss Marple said slowly, her voice soft but firm. Charles Forsyth was a man of ambition and control, perhaps too much of it. Could it be that Gregory resented his father's ways? Perhaps he felt overshadowed, pushed into a corner. What do you think, Mrs. Forsyth? Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Her gaze shifted, her eyes briefly meeting Gregory's, before looking back at Miss Marple. She wasn't going to say anything, at least not yet. But Miss Marple could feel the tension between mother and son, and it told her that there was far more to their relationship than they were letting on. Miss Marple's mind shifted back to Henry, who had remained unusually silent. Henry, she said softly, her tone gentle yet piercing. You've been with the family for so long. I imagine you've seen many things, things that most people wouldn't notice. Tell me, did you ever overhear anything between father and son that seemed off? Something you didn't quite understand? For a long moment, Henry didn't answer. He just stood there, his face as impassive as ever, but his eyes, those eyes, betrayed him. There was a flicker of something there, something like hesitation, before he spoke. "I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Marple," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "There were arguments, as there always are between a man of Mr. Forsyth's nature and a young man like Gregory, but nothing I would consider unusual." Miss Marple didn't press further, but her mind was racing now. Gregory had felt trapped, resentful, perhaps angry enough to lash out. Eleanor had her own hidden motives, perhaps guilt over protecting her son, perhaps fear of what he was capable of. And Henry had been hiding his own secrets, though it wasn't entirely clear what they were yet. Each one had a reason to be involved, and each one's version of events seemed to be shifting and bending, just enough to create doubt. The puzzle was far from complete, but Miss Marple was beginning to see the outline of the truth. The web of deception was tightening, and soon enough, it would all come unraveled. She just needed to pull the right thread. The fire had burned low by the time Miss Marple retired to the study, the events of the day weighing heavily on her mind. The authorities, buoyed by what they believed was a breakthrough, had practically declared the case solved. But something in the air didn't feel right to her. The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit together as neatly as they seemed. There was still something elusive, hovering just outside her grasp. Detective Harris had made his rounds, gathering the so-called evidence. The missing dagger found in Gregory's room, the overheard argument between Gregory and his father, the strained relationship between the family members. To him, it was all clear. The son had been the one to act out in anger, perhaps in a fit of rage after a heated dispute. The dagger was clearly the weapon, the motive was jealousy or resentment, and the pieces, so it seemed, were falling neatly into place. "It's over," Harris had said, with a satisfaction that bordered on smugness, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the near-solved case. The young man had everything to gain, and the weapon was right where we needed it to be. He'll be arrested by tomorrow. But Miss Marple knew better. She wasn't fooled by the apparent simplicity of the situation. There was an odd sense of finality in Harris's words, a sense that the investigation had reached its natural conclusion, but Miss Marple couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. The son, Gregory, might have been involved in the murder, but she couldn't shake the nagging thought that they were overlooking something crucial. She didn't believe the case was solved, not yet, not by a long shot. She sat by the desk, watching. The shadows creep across the room, her mind piecing together the events of the last few days. The dagger found in Gregory's room, an obvious clue, wasn't it? But what if it was planted? What if someone had gone to great lengths to make sure? That suspicion would fall squarely on him. Gregory's reaction had been strange from the start. Too defensive, too eager to protect himself, almost as if he had been expecting this line of questioning. Yet Miss Marple had seen him at other times, when he was unaware of her gaze, and those moments revealed a different side of him. A side that was angry, yes, but also afraid. What was he really afraid of? And why hadn't he mentioned anything about the dagger when they first spoke? Wasn't it strange that he'd only been caught with it after the authorities had begun to search the house and Eleanor? Miss Marple had not forgotten the way she had reacted when her son's name was mentioned in connection with the murder. That tightness in her voice, the subtle defensiveness, the way she had shielded Gregory from suspicion. There was more there than mere motherly instinct. There was something deeper at play. Miss Marple had seen it before, the way a parent could be driven to protect their child at all costs, even when they knew that child was capable of something far darker than they were willing to admit. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway, the faintest of taps at the door. She rose, walking toward it, her suspicions mounting. "Come in," she called, her voice steady but sharp. The door creaked open, and Detective Harris stepped inside, his face set with a mixture of triumph and confusion. He was holding a folder, the edges of the papers visibly crinkled, and his expression was tight, as though he had been holding back something important. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "we've found something. A letter that changes everything." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow but didn't say a word. Harris stepped forward, handing her the folder. As she opened it, she found a letter, typewritten and unsigned, addressed to Charles Forsyth. The contents were chillingly clear. "I know what you're planning, and I won't let you ruin my life. If you continue with your schemes, I'll have no choice but to stop you." There was a name at the bottom, a name Miss Marple hadn't expected to see. Henry. Her pulse quickened as she looked up at Harris. "This letter was found in your butler's room?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harris nodded, his expression dark. "We found it hidden in his belongings. It was addressed to Mr. Forsyth, and it's dated just days before the murder. We've questioned him, but he claims it's a misunderstanding, that he never meant any harm to his employer." "Of course, he does," Miss Marple muttered, her mind already racing. The idea of Henry being involved was unsettling, but the evidence was undeniable. The letter was a clear threat, and it tied Henry directly to the murder. Or did it? "Do you believe him?" Miss Marple asked, setting the letter down carefully. Harris hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the folder in his hand. "He's been with the family for years, Miss Marple. I'm not sure I can believe it, but the letter seems damning." Miss Marple sat back, her eyes never leaving Harris's face. "It may seem damning, but don't rush to conclusions, Harris. This letter is important, but it might not tell us what we think it does. Henry's loyalty to the Forsyths runs deep, doesn't it?" Harris nodded again, but there was a trace of uncertainty in his gaze now. Miss Marple could see that his conviction was starting to waver, though just slightly. "Henry may have been angry with his employer," she continued, "but it doesn't mean he killed him. It's too easy, too convenient to assume that just because there was a letter, there was a murder. We must consider what the letter really says. What if Henry didn't write it at all? What if someone else is trying to frame him?" "But who would do that?" Harris pressed, his frustration beginning to show. "It doesn't make sense. The letter came from his room. We found it in his things." Miss Marple leaned forward, folding her hands neatly in front of her. What if the letter was planted? What if someone wanted to make sure Henry was the one who would take the fall? Think about it. Gregory has the dagger. Eleanor has her secrets. Could it be that someone is using Henry as a scapegoat? Harris didn't answer at first. He seemed to be considering her words, and for a brief moment, the smug confidence he'd had earlier evaporated. "I'll need to speak with Henry again," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "Perhaps we've been too quick to judge him." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes narrowing. The case was far from over, and the so-called breakthrough with the letter had only added more layers to the mystery. There was still so much left to uncover, so many motives to untangle. Gregory, Eleanor, Henry, all of them had their reasons for being involved. But Miss Marple was no closer to the truth than she had been before. The real criminal was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And Miss Marple knew deep down that the answers she sought were closer than they appeared, hidden behind a series of false victories just waiting to be uncovered. The days stretched on, each one filled with more questions than answers. Despite the flurry of activity, despite the conviction with which the authorities had declared the case solved, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something significant, had been overlooked. She had learned long ago that the truth wasn't always what it appeared to be, and in her experience, the most important clues often lay in the things no one thought to notice. It was during one of her solitary evenings, after the house had quieted, that she found it. The forgotten case. An old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, tucked into a forgotten drawer at the back of her desk. It had caught her eye as she flipped through papers absently, and the moment she read the headline, something clicked in her mind. Charles Forsyth's past. Revisited. The disappearance of Lydia Forsyth. The article, dated nearly 20 years ago, was brief, offering little more than the barest of details. It spoke of a young woman, Lydia Forsyth, who had gone missing, without a trace from the very same estate where Charles now lived. The article mentioned no foul play, but the disappearance was odd enough to make headlines. Lydia had been a relative, perhaps a cousin or niece, and she had vanished shortly after a family dispute. No one had ever found out what happened to her, and the case was quietly closed, as so many such cases were. But something about it felt off to Miss Marple. Something about the way the story had faded, the lack of resolution, hinted at a deeper mystery that had been buried for far too long. The connection hit her then. She turned the newspaper clipping over, scanning the names in the small, almost forgotten print. Lydia Forsyth, daughter of Charles's estranged brother, Thomas Forsyth. That name, Thomas Forsyth, stirred something in her memory. Thomas had been the black sheep of the family, a man known for his temper and his reckless behavior. He had disappeared around the same time as Lydia, his fate as unclear as hers. But what struck Miss Marple most was a small detail buried within the article. A brief mention that the last person to see Lydia Forsyth alive was none other than Henry, the butler. The shock of the revelation sent a chill down her spine. Henry had been with the Forsyth family for decades, a figure so loyal, so unobtrusive that his presence had always been taken for granted. But this new detail, this connection to the past, put everything into a new light. What if Henry's involvement in Lydia's disappearance had never been fully investigated? What if, all these years later, the ghosts of the past were now rising, again influencing the present? Miss Marple felt a pull, a need to understand more. She couldn't ignore the strange sense of déjà vu that gripped her. Henry had a history, one that he had never fully revealed. She closed the drawer with a slow, deliberate motion, feeling the weight of the discovery settle in her chest. The shadows of the past were far from gone. The next morning, Miss Marple took a different approach. She had already spoken to the authorities, and they were all too eager to accept the neatly packaged version of events that placed the murder squarely on Gregory's shoulders. The discovery of the letter had seemed to confirm their suspicions, but Miss Marple had her doubts, and now, with the new information about Henry, she felt the urgency to speak to him again, this time without the usual polite pleasantries. She needed the truth, and she wasn't going to settle for anything less. Henry, as usual, had an air of calm authority about him when she found him in the kitchen, preparing a meal as though nothing was amiss. The weather outside had cleared, the storm of the previous days now a distant memory, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with unsaid words. He straightened when he saw her, but Miss Marple noticed the slight flicker in his eyes, the same flicker she had seen in him the night of the murder, when he had been so careful in his answers. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Henry said in his usual measured tone. "How can I assist you today?" Miss Marple studied him for a moment, then smiled. Softly, "Henry, you've been so helpful already, but there's something I must ask you. I recently came across a small detail that piqued my curiosity. Do you remember the disappearance of Lydia Forsyth?" The question hung in the air, and for a long moment, Henry didn't speak. His face remained impassive, but his hands trembled slightly as he wiped them on a dish towel, his movements slower than usual. "I remember the incident well, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight. "But that's something from the past. Something I'd rather not revisit." Miss Marple's eyes never left him. "But the past has a way of catching up with us, doesn't it? Especially when it involves family. You were the last person to see Lydia Forsyth alive, weren't you, Henry?" Henry's eyes narrowed, just for a moment, before his expression returned to its usual stoic calm. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to," he said quietly, almost too quietly. "Lydia left of her own accord. No one was to blame." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, that's what everyone believed. But you and I both know that there are things left unsaid. Sometimes what seems like a disappearance is more than it appears. Could it be that someone was hiding something back then, just as someone is hiding something now?" The silence between them was thick, charged with the weight of unspoken truths. Henry turned away briefly as though to collect his thoughts, and Miss Marple noticed the subtle way his fingers twitched at the edge of the counter. He was nervous, and his calm demeanor was beginning to crack. "I've said all there is to say, Miss Marple," he replied, his voice hardening. "It was a tragic event, nothing more, and I don't see how it has anything to do with the current situation." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her voice remained firm. "I'm afraid it does, Henry. You see, the past doesn't just disappear. Sometimes it lingers, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And I believe that moment is now. Lydia Forsyth's disappearance, her connection to your past, might just hold the key to understanding what really happened to Charles Forsyth." Henry stiffened visibly, and Miss Marple watched him carefully, noting the tension in his posture, the way his fingers clenched into fists at his sides. It was a small movement, but it was enough to reveal the cracks in his carefully constructed mask. "I don't know what you're implying," Henry said, his voice strained, but there was a tremor beneath the words. "I've worked for the Forsyth family for years. I've served them faithfully. I would never harm them." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her voice soft, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I believe you, Henry. But the truth is, the past has a way of shaping us in ways we don't always understand. And sometimes, the sins of the past come back to haunt us. You were involved in Lydia's disappearance, weren't you? Henry's eyes flickered briefly with something, fear, guilt, or perhaps a blend of both. Then, just as quickly, he forced it back down, hiding it beneath a mask of professionalism. "I didn't harm her," he said finally, his voice low. "But I knew something. Something I wish I hadn't. And now it seems the past is catching up with me." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as the pieces began to fit together. The shadows of the past were far from gone. They had never truly disappeared. The truth was always there, buried in the corners, waiting for the right moment to surface. She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me, Henry, what happened to Lydia Forsyth, and how does it connect to Charles's death?" For a long moment, Henry didn't speak. Then, slowly, he turned toward her, his face etched with regret. "The past never truly lets go, does it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Miss Marple knew then that the final piece of the puzzle had been set in motion. The shadows of the past had come to light, and the truth was closer than ever. The revelation in Henry's words had been a powerful one, but it was still only the beginning. Miss Marple sat in the dim light of the study, reflecting on the conversation with the butler. Something in his tone had shifted, and though he hadn't yet given her the full truth, she knew he was close to cracking. His guilt was palpable, his facade worn thin. Yet there was still something that didn't sit right. She had seen many similar situations before, where a confession was close, but not yet complete. It was the way people shielded themselves with half-truths, hiding the darker parts of their deeds, unwilling to reveal the entire story. It was time to push Henry further, but she couldn't do it directly. He was too cautious now, too aware. No, Miss Marple needed to approach this carefully, as she always did, by exploiting the very traits that had allowed him to remain hidden for so long. The idea came to her in a flash, a memory from a case long ago where she had used subtle psychological tactics to elicit the truth from a suspect. She knew she needed a distraction, something to throw Henry off balance, to make him forget, even for a moment, that he was being observed. The old method still worked after all, and she trusted her instincts more than anything else. The next morning, she made her way to the kitchen, where Henry was once again preparing the family's breakfast. She observed him for a moment from the doorway, taking note of his movements. He was meticulous, organized, but there was a nervous energy beneath his composed exterior. He hadn't expected her this early. "Good morning, Henry," Miss Marple greeted, stepping inside the room with a gentle smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I simply wanted to ask you something, if you don't mind." Henry turned, his face neutral as ever, but there was a flicker of tension in his eyes. "Of course, Miss Marple. How can I assist you?" Miss Marple let her eyes wander around the room, as though her attention were distracted by the usual sights of the kitchen. "I've been thinking about Lydia Forsyth again. You know, it's so strange how certain details escape us. We get so caught up in the present that we forget what happened before. Do you remember anything unusual about the night she disappeared?" Henry's face didn't change. He simply kept stirring the pot on the stove, his gaze steady. "I've told you, Miss Marple. There's nothing unusual to report. She left on her own accord. But of course, Miss Marple murmured, as though she were speaking to herself. That's what everyone thought. But sometimes, when we go back, when we dig deeper, we find that what seems so simple is actually so much more complicated. You see, I've been wondering if we're all looking at this wrong. Perhaps Lydia didn't disappear at all. Perhaps she was taken, not by force, but by someone who, well, let's say someone who knew her, someone who understood her better than we might realize. Henry's hand froze in mid-air as he reached for the pepper. It was an almost imperceptible shift, but it was there. He was no longer the composed butler. His mask had cracked for a moment, revealing something beneath. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft yet deliberate. I find myself thinking of all the things we overlook. People's motives are so often tied to their emotions, aren't they? It's easy to hide things under a polite veneer, to say what people expect to hear, but emotions are harder to conceal. She let her words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. I'm sure you know this well, Henry. You've been with the Forsyth family for so long. You must have seen it all. The secrets, the hidden resentments, the quiet anger. It's not always the ones who show their rage that we need to worry about, but those who hide it behind their smiles. There it was again, another tiny shift in his demeanor. His shoulders tensed, his fingers gripped the edge of the counter, and Miss Marple knew that he had caught the meaning of her words. He had been expecting her to continue the discussion on Lydia's disappearance in a more direct way. He had assumed she would press him, but instead, Miss Marple had skirted around the issue entirely, weaving in a more subtle angle, one that made him confront his own inner turmoil. Henry's voice, when it came, was tight, strained. I don't know what you're talking about, Miss Marple. There's no reason to bring up the past. The past is done with. I suppose, Miss Marple said, with a slight nod, her eyes narrowing just slightly. But you know, Henry, there's a difference between the past being over and the past being buried. Sometimes when we bury things, they come back to haunt us. They come back in ways we don't expect. She took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. Now, you've been very patient with me, and I appreciate that. But if we're to understand what happened to Charles Forsyth, we need to understand everything, every detail. I'm sure you'd agree, wouldn't you? After all, it's only fair to see the full picture, don't you think? For a long moment, Henry stood still, his eyes locked on hers, and Miss Marple could almost feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air. The silence stretched between them, thick and palpable. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, Henry dropped his gaze. The change was so subtle that Miss Marple would have missed it if she weren't paying close attention. Didn't mean for things to go this far, Henry muttered, his voice low. He wiped his hands on the towel again, his movements becoming erratic. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't show it. Instead, she smiled gently, knowing that she had broken through. Henry, she said, her voice softening, it's not about wanting to hurt anyone. It's about what we do when we're pushed to the edge, when we feel we have no other choice. You made choices back then, didn't you? Choices that in the moment seemed necessary. Henry's shoulders sagged, and for the first time Miss Marple saw the cracks in his composure. I never meant for Lydia to disappear. But I couldn't let her ruin everything. She knew too much. She was going to tell Charles about things that would have destroyed the family. So, I did what I thought I had to do. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind racing. The pieces were falling into place now, but the mystery was far from over. Henry had been involved in Lydia's disappearance, and that involvement was now tied to Charles's death. But the true nature of the crime, the depth of the deception, was still eluding her. "And Charles?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but piercing. "What was it that Lydia knew about him, and how does that connect to what happened to him?" Henry's face tightened, his eyes avoiding hers. Charles. Charles wasn't the man everyone thought he was. He had his own secrets, his own darkness. Lydia was going to expose him, and I couldn't let that happen. I didn't kill him, Miss Marple, but I had my hand in things. I kept the past buried, and now it's all coming back. Miss Marple's mind whirled, each piece of the puzzle moving into place. The past had a way of coming back when least expected. And now it was clear. The murder wasn't just about money or revenge. It was about secrets. Secrets that had been buried for years, only to resurface in a deadly confrontation. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, her eyes focused on Henry, her mind already planning the next move. The answers were within reach, but the final question, who had truly killed Charles Forsyth, was still hanging in the air. The truth was getting closer, and Miss Marple knew that in the end it would all come down to the one thing everyone had underestimated, the shadows of the past. The air in the Forsyth estate had thickened since Miss Marple's conversation with Henry. The tension was palpable, like the quiet before a storm. She had learned more than she expected from him, but the revelations had only raised more questions. It seemed every answer she uncovered led her to a deeper labyrinth of lies, betrayals, and secrets. Henry's admission about Lydia had given her a clearer sense of direction, but the details were still murky. Why had he let things spiral so far? What role had the Forsyth family played in all of this? And then there was the matter of Charles Forsyth's murder. Henry's reluctance to speak directly about it had planted a seed of doubt in Miss Marple's mind. Had he been involved in the murder itself, or was he trying to protect someone else? Could someone have killed Charles to keep his secrets buried, or was there another motive at play, one even darker than Miss Marple had imagined? As she sat in the study reviewing her notes, the sudden sound of footsteps in the hall caught her attention. It was Henry again, this time moving quickly, his face pale. He knocked lightly on the doorframe, and Miss Marple looked up from her papers, raising an eyebrow. "Miss Marple," he said, voice strained. "There's been a problem." Miss Marple's stomach tightened. She motioned for him to come in, her senses alert. "What is it, Henry?" "It's the letter, the one from Lydia," he said, looking over his shoulder as though expecting someone to appear from the shadows. "It's gone." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, a cold feeling creeping through her. "Gone?" "Yes," Henry confirmed, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the doorframe. "It was here, on the desk last night. The letter was the key to everything. It's the one Lydia wrote before she disappeared. It had all the details, the threats, everything she knew about Charles and the family." Miss Marple's mind raced, but she kept her expression calm. "And now it's missing. Who else had access to the study last night?" Henry swallowed hard. "No, one. Only myself and Mrs. Forsyth. But she didn't know about the letter. I made sure of that. I kept it hidden." "Are you sure?" Miss Marple's tone was carefully measured. "Could it be that someone else found it?" Henry shook his head. "I don't know. I don't think so. It was just It was here, and now it's not. Miss Marple stood, her thoughts already moving at lightning speed. A crucial piece of evidence had vanished, and with it, so had the fragile thread connecting many of the unanswered questions. Whoever had taken it knew exactly how important it was. They had moved quickly, and they were covering their tracks with alarming precision. "Is there any chance that it could have been misplaced?" Miss Marple asked, her voice deceptively gentle. "No." "Miss Marple," Henry said, his voice tight with frustration. "I'm certain I checked everywhere. It was here last night, and now it's gone." "I've looked through the entire study. It's as if it never existed." Miss Marple walked slowly around the room, her mind working over the possibilities. She knew that the disappearance of the letter was no accident. Someone was deliberately trying to obscure the truth. The question was, who? And why now, when everything seemed so close to falling into place? The old detective felt her pulse quicken as the stakes of the investigation were raised. She had been working on the assumption that she could slowly untangle the web of lies and find the person responsible for Charles's death. Now, with this new development, she knew she had to proceed with caution. Whoever was pulling the strings had become aware of her scrutiny, and they were willing to do whatever it took to stop her. Henry's agitation was palpable, but Miss Marple knew better than to let herself be swayed by his nervousness. She turned to face him fully. "Do you have any idea who could be behind this? Any sense of who might have taken it?" Henry looked away, his eyes darting about as though searching for an escape. I don't know, but I have my suspicions." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "Who?" He hesitated, swallowing hard before speaking again. "It's Mrs. Forsyth. I didn't want to believe it, but she's been acting strange lately. Ever since Charles's death, I've caught her looking through papers, and her mood has been off." Miss Marple considered this new lead carefully. Mrs. Forsyth had always been a bit of an enigma, but there had been nothing overtly suspicious about her behavior before now. But then again, the woman had been hiding behind the walls of propriety for years. It was always the ones who hid in plain sight who were the hardest to uncover. Miss Marple gave Henry a long, hard look. "You've been with the family for a long time, Henry. Do you think your suspicions are justified, or is there something else at play here?" He didn't respond immediately, his gaze turning inward as if reflecting on his own thoughts. Finally he spoke, voice low and strained. "I don't know. But I do know something strange has been going on. I've seen things that don't make sense. And I think Mrs. Forsyth might be more involved than we think." Miss Marple nodded slowly, piecing together the fragments of his confession. Henry was more tangled in this mess than he was willing to admit. But now wasn't the time to press him further. The missing letter was the key to the mystery, and without it, she would have to shift her focus elsewhere. "I'll need to speak with Mrs. Forsyth," Miss Marple said calmly, her mind already running through her options. "And I'll need to see where she spends her time, what she's been doing since Charles's death. There may be more to this than meets the eye." Henry nodded, though his expression was filled with apprehension. "Be careful, Miss Marple. She's not the person you think she is." Miss Marple gave him a reassuring smile. "I'll keep that in mind." As she made her way to the main part of the house, Miss Marple's thoughts were consumed by the possibility that someone was actively trying to bury the truth. The disappearance of the letter wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a deliberate attempt to obstruct the investigation. Someone was working against her, and they weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. The stakes had never been higher. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of lies and deception, and Miss Marple was determined to find it no matter what it took. She just hoped that in the end, the shadows wouldn't swallow her whole. Miss Marple had just left the study, her mind already racing with the possibilities of Mrs. Forsyth's involvement. She had no time to waste. There was no telling what the woman might be hiding. But as she walked through the darkened halls of the Forsyth estate, a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the drafty corridors. It wasn't just the looming sense of danger. It was something else, something far more pressing. The house felt off. The air was too still, too silent. Miss Marple had been in enough mansions to know when the weight of a place became too much to bear, when the walls seemed to be holding their breath. It wasn't the usual sort of heaviness one felt in the presence of an unsolved crime. This was something else entirely. Suddenly a scream pierced the silence. It was a woman's scream, sharp and blood-curdling, echoing through the grand hallway. Without a second thought, Miss Marple broke into a run, her slippered feet swift and sure, against the cold stone floors. She didn't know who had screamed, but she knew that whoever it was had seen something horrifying. She rounded the corner to the drawing room, her heart pounding in her chest. The door was ajar, and she pushed it open without hesitation, her eyes scanning the room. It was Mrs. Forsyth. The woman stood in the center of the room, her hand clutching her chest, eyes wide with terror. Her normally composed face was now contorted in fear. But it wasn't just her reaction that made Miss Marple freeze in place. It was the body lying on the floor. Lydia Forsyth. The same woman Miss Marple had suspected of knowing too much, the one who had vanished from the scene earlier, was now lying motionless, blood pooling around her. A single silver dagger was buried deep in her chest. Miss Marple's mind flickered back to the stories she had heard of the Forsyth family, of all the hidden animosities and deceit, and she knew that this was no coincidence. This was the second murder in a span of days, and it wasn't just a coincidence that it had happened right when the investigation was gaining momentum. Whoever was behind this had been playing a far deeper game than she had imagined. Mrs. Forsyth, Miss Marple said, her voice calm, though her pulse raced. What happened here? Mrs. Forsyth's eyes darted to the body on the floor before flicking back to Miss Marple. She was trembling, but the tears she might have expected to see were absent. Instead, the woman's expression was hard to read, a mixture of guilt, confusion, and something darker, something that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. I didn't do this. Mrs. Forsyth's voice was hoarse, but she spoke with an edge, as though she were trying to convince herself as much as the detective. I don't know what happened. I came in, and I found her like this. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. But you're certain you didn't see or hear anything unusual? Mrs. Forsyth shook her head, but Miss Marple wasn't convinced. Something didn't add up. The blood was still fresh, the dagger still embedded in Lydia's chest, and yet there was a strange stillness to the room, as if the violence had happened ages ago. How had Mrs. Forsyth not heard the struggle? Before Miss Marple could ask another question, a voice cut through the air, this one harsh and accusing. Enough! Miss Marple turned to see Henry standing in the doorway, his face pale but angry. He stepped into the room with a determined stride, his eyes fixed on the corpse of Lydia. I told you, there's something wrong here. And you're the one who's been hiding it from all of us. Henry's gaze snapped to his wife. What did you do, Clara? Clara Forsyth's eyes widened with shock, but Miss Marple saw the flicker of something darker pass through them. She was quick to mask it, but the detective had already caught the subtle shift in her expression. What do you mean, Henry? Clara's voice was sharp, but the attempt to maintain control in the face of such a disaster fell flat. I didn't do anything. You saw me. I just found her like this. I swear. Henry took a step forward, his face red with frustration. I knew it. I knew you were involved in this somehow. You're hiding something, Clara, and now we have 2 dead bodies to prove it. Clara backed away slightly, her face twisted in a mask of disbelief. I don't know what you're talking about, she whispered, almost pleading. But the doubt in her voice only made her seem more suspicious. Miss Marple watched the exchange silently, her mind turning. She had learned enough over the years to know that guilt was rarely as clear as it seemed. Henry's outburst, while genuine, felt far too emotional for someone who had just walked into the room. His reaction suggested knowledge of something that hadn't been revealed yet, a hidden connection, a dark secret. But there was still too much unknown. Before she could question them further, a chill ran down her spine. She had been so focused on the confrontation in front of her that she hadn't heard the faint rustling behind her. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled as the room seemed to grow colder. A sound, a creak, like a footstep on the wooden floor. Miss Marple turned, quickly, but it was too late. A figure emerged from the shadows in the doorway, moving with a fluidity that betrayed their intention. The figure was masked, their face obscured by a dark cloth, and in their hand was a weapon, another silver dagger gleaming in the dim light. Clara screamed, but before anyone could react, the figure lunged forward, aiming the blade directly at Miss Marple. The detective sidestepped the attack just in time, narrowly avoiding the sharp edge of the dagger. The masked figure was quick, but Miss Marple had dealt with more than enough threats to keep her wits about her. She grabbed a nearby chair, using it to block the next strike. Henry stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with disbelief. Clara, too, was paralyzed with fear. Miss Marple could see it now. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was deliberate, coordinated. Whoever was behind this had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. Now, the villain was still ahead of her, and now her task had changed. It was no longer about solving the crime. It was about staying alive long enough to uncover the truth. The masked figure stumbled back, momentarily off balance from the force of Miss Marple's defensive maneuver. It was enough to give her a brief moment to think. The chair she had grabbed still held the assailant at bay, but not for long. The gleam of the silver dagger in the dim light told her all she needed to know. This was not a random act. The assailant was determined, trained. With a quick, practiced motion, Miss Marple sidestepped another strike, grabbing the wrist of the would-be attacker. The dagger was close, so close, but she twisted the assailant's arm, forcing them to drop it to the floor with a loud clatter. In that instant, the figure hesitated. A slip, just long enough for Miss Marple to push forward and disarm them completely. The masked figure stumbled back, pressing a hand to their face as though trying to steady themselves, but their body language spoke volumes. They were caught. Before Miss Marple could make her next move, Henry rushed forward, his eyes wide with panic. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "Why are you doing this? The masked figure didn't answer. Instead, they darted for the door, their movements swift and fluid, but Miss Marple was already on alert. There was a quickness in their escape, an air of familiarity with the house, that made her pause. No ordinary intruder would know the layout of the Forsyth estate so well. This was someone who belonged here, or at the very least had been here before. "Stop," Miss Marple commanded, stepping toward the door, but the figure was already gone. Henry swore under his breath. "We've got to find them. We can't let them get away." But Miss Marple stood still for a moment, her mind racing. A new thought had emerged in the turmoil, one that clicked with startling clarity. The clue had been there all along, but it had been too small to notice until now. It wasn't the figure itself, or the attempt on her life. It was the way the figure moved, and something in the conversation with Henry had triggered it. He had said, "You're hiding something, Clara." It was that casual remark that held the key. Miss Marple turned toward Clara, who stood in stunned silence, her eyes fixed on the door where the figure had vanished. For a moment the woman seemed lost in her thoughts, but there was something in her posture, something rigid and stiff, that drew Miss Marple's attention. It wasn't fear, it was something else. Clara's fingers twitched at her side. Miss Marple knew that gesture well. It was the kind of movement a person made when they were trying to suppress guilt, to keep something buried. She hadn't noticed it earlier, but now the pattern began to form in her mind. Clara had been in a position to know exactly when, and where things were about to take a dangerous turn. "Clara, you're hiding something," Miss Marple said softly, her voice calm but firm. "You know who that person was, don't you?" Clara's eyes widened, but only for a split second. Then she recovered, shaking her head. "I don't know who that was. I've never seen them before." But Miss Marple had already pieced it together. The room had been too quiet. The house had been too still. The masked figure had moved with the kind of ease that suggested they were far too comfortable in the Forsyth mansion. They hadn't come through the front door in a hurry. They'd moved with a plan. It clicked. Miss Marple's mind sharpened as she looked at Clara with newfound suspicion. The strange arrangement of objects in the study earlier, the misplaced chair, the odd way Lydia had been positioned. It all pointed to something far deeper than what appeared on the surface. Clara wasn't just hiding the truth. She was a part of it. "You've been working with them," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but insistent. Clara's breath caught, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath, suspended in time. Henry looked back and forth between the two women, his confusion mounting, but Miss Marple was beyond him now. She knew the truth, or at least the key to unlocking it. "The dagger," Miss Marple continued, her tone matter of fact. "It's too clean. No one uses a weapon like that unless they've planned their moves carefully. Whoever was behind this had more to do with this estate than we've realized." Clara's lips pressed into a tight line, and for a long moment she remained silent. But Miss Marple wasn't done. "Lydia knew something," Miss Marple added, watching for any reaction. "She knew something that got her killed, and I believe she was going to tell me. She was going to tell me about the person in this very room." Clara stiffened. Henry stepped forward again, this time looking less like a helpless bystander and more like someone who was finally putting together the pieces. "Clara, what is she talking about? What's going on?" Clara swallowed, her gaze darting toward the door. The longer she hesitated, the more Miss Marple understood. Her silence spoke louder than words. "I don't want to hurt you, Clara," Miss Marple said quietly, but her eyes never left the woman before her. "But if you don't start telling me the truth, there's no going back. I've seen the pattern. You don't have much time left." Clara's eyes flitted around the room, and for a moment, Miss Marple saw the mask of composure slip. The panic was there now, buried beneath a thin veil of calm. It was just enough to make her voice crack as she spoke. "It's not what you think," Clara said, her words rushed. I didn't want any of this to happen. I just wanted to protect us." But Miss Marple had already figured out the rest. The dark secrets hidden in the Forsyth family's past were more than just a series of dangerous misunderstandings. They were a trap, carefully laid over years, and now that trap had sprung. "The real question, Clara, is not what you want," Miss Marple said, "but what you're willing to do to keep the past buried." Clara's face paled. The pattern had finally emerged. The truth, though elusive, was no longer something to fear. It was something that would soon be revealed. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps, her eyes flicking toward the door as though considering an escape, but Miss Marple could see that the woman was already cornered. The room felt colder now, the silence hanging thick with the weight of what was being left unsaid. "You think you can control this, Clara?" Miss Marple said gently, her voice low and persistent. "But the truth always finds its way to the surface." For a moment, there was a flicker of something in Clara's expression, defeat perhaps, or simply the realization that the walls were closing in. She opened her mouth to speak, but her words faltered. Miss Marple, sensing the moment, stepped forward slowly, her eyes never leaving Clara's. "I know you don't want to hurt anyone," Miss Marple continued, "but you've already done so much. Don't you want it to end? Don't you want to stop this before someone else gets hurt?" Clara looked away, her lips trembling as she bit down on them, clearly fighting with herself. Finally, she sank into a chair near the fireplace, her body tense and resigned. Her eyes found the floor, and for a long moment there was nothing but the sound of her labored breathing. Then, in a soft whisper, Clara spoke. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. It wasn't supposed to end like this." Henry moved to her side, reaching out a hand, but Miss Marple raised a hand to stop him. This was Clara's moment, and the detective knew it would be better to let her speak when she was ready. "The truth," Clara began, her voice catching, "was that Lydia knew about the inheritance. She knew about the family's past and the secrets we've been hiding for so long." Miss Marple's mind sharpened at the mention of inheritance. She'd suspected money had been part of the motive. Family, wealth, disputes over property, but there was more to it than that. Clara's words hinted at a darker, deeper reason. "What secrets?" Miss Marple pressed, her voice calm but commanding. Clara's eyes met hers, then quickly dropped. "The Forsyth family. We've never been what people thought we were. Not even close." Henry frowned, confused. "What are you talking about? What does that have to do with Lydia?" Clara looked at her brother, her expression filled with sorrow. "It's not just about the money, Henry. It's about power. It's about control. There's something in this house, something that could destroy us all if the truth ever came out." Miss Marple stepped closer, her mind racing. "The inheritance, yes, but it wasn't just a fortune, was it? It was something else, something buried in the past." Clara nodded, tears now welling in her eyes. Lydia found out. She figured it out. The reason why our family has so much wealth, why we live in this enormous house, why the Forsyth name carries so much weight. It wasn't earned by hard work or by good investments. It was built on lies, on something much darker. Henry shook his head, still lost. What are you saying? What lies? Clara looked up at Miss Marple, her gaze shifting from fear to desperation. The Forsyth family, they weren't the people they claimed to be. They weren't the noble bloodline they said they were. They came into money through illegal means, through manipulation and corruption. It wasn't just a few shady business deals. It was much worse than that. Miss Marple felt her stomach twist. She'd suspected something in the Forsyth family's history didn't add up, but she hadn't imagined it went this far. You're telling me your family's wealth is built on crime, Miss Marple said, her voice steady, though her mind raced to understand the full scope of what Clara was revealing. Clara nodded, her face pale. Lydia found out about an old connection, something that went back to the very beginning of our family's fortune. She found records, files, a trail that led to something unspeakable. She wasn't going to let it go. She planned to tell you, Miss Marple. She was going to expose us. Miss Marple felt a sharp sense of clarity, the final piece falling into place. And you couldn't let that happen. Clara's silence was all the answer Miss Marple needed. The stakes had been much higher than anyone had realized. The Forsyth family's legacy, their wealth, their power, it all rested on a secret that no one could afford to reveal, and Lydia had been the one to stumble upon it. Tell me, Clara, Miss Marple said softly. What did Lydia discover? Clara seemed to shrink into herself, her voice barely audible. There was someone in our family's past, who was involved in criminal activity, something so far-reaching, so destructive, that it would have ruined us all if it came out. But Lydia was too clever. She pieced things together, and when she confronted me, she was going to go to the authorities. She was going to destroy everything. Miss Marple knew the answer before Clara could even say it. It wasn't just a matter of protecting money or reputation. It was about a criminal tie so deep that the Forsyth family would never survive the fallout. The depth of the betrayal that Clara felt had pushed her to the brink. She had killed to preserve not just her family's wealth, but their entire existence. The motive wasn't greed, it was desperation. Desperation to bury a truth too ugly for anyone to bear. I didn't want to do it, Clara whispered, her hands wringing in her lap. But when she threatened to tell you, when she said she was going to expose everything, I didn't see any other way. Miss Marple understood. The walls had closed in around Clara, and she had reacted out of fear, not just for herself, but for her family. The Forsyth name wasn't a title, it was an illusion, a constructed image built on lies, half-truths, and criminal acts. Clara, Miss Marple said softly, the truth was always going to come out. You couldn't hide it forever. Clara's eyes filled with tears. I know, but I was trying to protect us. I thought if I could just stop Lydia, if I could just make her disappear. You killed her because you thought you had no other choice. Miss Marple finished for her, her voice still calm but laced with a quiet understanding. Clara nodded, the weight of her actions pressing down on her with the finality of everything she had tried to hide. Henry stood in stunned silence, but Miss Marple could see the moment his world cracked. His family's past had been a lie, And now, the truth had cost them everything. The room was silent, except for the faint sound of a clock ticking on the mantel, each second like a heartbeat in the charged atmosphere. Miss Marple stood in the centre of the drawing room, her eyes never leaving Clara's. It was a silent, quiet confrontation, one that had been building for days. The truth had been laid bare, and Clara knew there was no more room for deceit. Clara's face was pale, her eyes bloodshot from the sleepless nights and the stress that had racked her body since the moment Lydia's body had been found. It was over, but Clara didn't want to accept it. Miss Marple could see it in the slight trembling of her hands, in the way her lips twitched as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. "Clara, the truth is out," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but laced with the faintest trace of sorrow. "It's time to stop hiding, no more lies." Clara looked away, pressing her palms into her eyes as though willing herself to deny what was happening. But there was no escaping it now. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I only wanted to keep it from getting worse." "Clara," Miss Marple said, moving closer, her voice soft but firm. "The moment you decided to kill Lydia, you made it worse. The lie, the secret, it would have come out eventually, whether you liked it or not. You've already destroyed everything you were trying to protect. There's nothing left." Clara glanced at Henry, who was standing by the door, his face pale and drawn. He had been watching the entire exchange in silence, barely able to come to terms with the reality of what his sister had done. He had always believed in the family, in the history, in the facade that had been carefully built over the years. The truth had shattered all of it. "I had to protect you," Clara said, her voice breaking as she looked back at Miss Marple. "I had to protect us. From everything." "From what?" Miss Marple asked, her gaze sharp as she took another step closer. "You were protecting a lie, Clara, and that lie has hurt everyone. Lydia wasn't just trying to ruin you. She was trying to expose something that couldn't be hidden anymore." Clara's eyes flicked toward the window, as though she were considering running, as though she believed she could still escape. But deep down, she knew she couldn't outrun the consequences. She had already been caught. "I didn't know what else to do," Clara whispered. "When she found out, when she started threatening to expose everything, I panicked. I thought if I just made her disappear." Her voice faltered as she looked at her brother, unable to finish the sentence. The guilt was too much for her to bear now. Miss Marple's gaze softened. She knew that Clara's actions hadn't been driven solely by malice. Fear had been the guiding force, fear of losing everything, but that fear had turned into something far more dangerous, something far more destructive than she could have ever imagined. "It's not too late, Clara," Miss Marple said gently. "You can still make this right. You can still tell the truth. The consequences will be severe, but you can stop lying to yourself." Clara's body trembled as she looked down at her, hands clenching and unclenching them as if the act of letting go would cause the walls to crumble around her. She had been holding on to this secret for so long, and now, finally, it was all coming undone. "I never wanted to kill her," Clara whispered, almost to herself. "I never wanted to destroy everything we had. But I couldn't lose it all, Miss Marple. You don't understand." "I understand more than you think," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm. "But your fear doesn't change the truth. The truth remains, no matter what. Suddenly, Clara's eyes widened in something like panic, and she turned toward the door, making a dash for it. She hadn't fully accepted what was happening, and now, in a moment of desperation, she was trying to flee, to run away from the mess she had created. But Miss Marple was prepared. She had already anticipated this final move. Before Clara could reach the door, Henry stepped forward, his expression full of confusion and anger. "Clara, don't run!" he pleaded, his voice rough. "Stop, it's over, please!" Clara froze, her body tense, caught between the door and her brother's words. For a moment, it seemed as if she might bolt, but then she collapsed to the floor, her hands pressing into her face as sobs racked her body. "I'm sorry," she gasped, her voice muffled by her hands. "I didn't know what else to do. I was scared. I was so scared." Miss Marple stood back, watching as Clara fell apart. There was no more need for interrogation, no more need for questions. The truth had been laid bare, and it had broken Clara. The detective knew that for all her years of observation, there was one thing Clara had never understood: the weight of what she had done, the irreversible nature of her actions. "I know," Miss Marple said softly, her voice filled with compassion. "It's over now, Clara. You can't undo what you've done, but you can take responsibility for it. That's the first step." Henry knelt beside his sister, his face torn. The truth was too much for him to accept, too overwhelming. But there was no going back now. The lies had been exposed, and the Forsyth family's world was shattered. As Miss Marple turned to leave, her mind already racing through the final steps, contacting the authorities, ensuring Clara's confession was properly handled, she paused in the doorway. She looked back at the siblings, her gaze piercing and unyielding. "Remember this, both of you," she said. "The truth may be painful, but it is always the one thing that will set you free." With that, she stepped out of the room, leaving behind the broken pieces of a family, a shattered legacy, and the knowledge that, in the end, no secret could stay hidden forever. Miss Marple stood in the hallway, her hand resting lightly on the doorknob. She had done what needed to be done. Clara was broken, confessional and remorseful, and the pieces of the case had been neatly assembled. The authorities had already been contacted, and the family would be forced to reckon with the fallout of their lies. But as the soft ticking of the clock echoed in the quiet, a strange sensation crawled over her skin. Something wasn't quite right. She paused for a moment longer than usual, listening to the hum of the house. Nothing sounded out of place. The conversation with Clara had been draining, emotionally and mentally, but the case was, for all intents and purposes, resolved. And yet Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. A sudden sound, a sharp knock at the door, ripped her from her thoughts. She turned quickly, her instincts kicking in. Without hesitation, she opened the door, only to find a young constable standing there, breathless. "Miss Marple," the constable said, his voice strained, "I'm sorry to bother you, but there's been a development. Something. It doesn't make sense." "Please, come in," Miss Marple said, stepping aside. She motioned for him to sit, already feeling the weight of the unexpected twist settling in. Her mind was already racing. "What has happened?" The constable hesitated, glancing toward the hallway where Clara and Henry remained, still processing the events of the evening. The detective gestured for him to speak freely. "It's about the body, Lydia Forsyth's body," the constable said, his face pale. We just got a report from the medical examiner. There's something odd about the cause of death. It doesn't line up with Clara's confession, Miss Ya. Marple's heart skipped a beat. Clara's confession had been clear, almost too clear. She had admitted to the murder, to the guilt, to the cover-up. It had fit all the pieces together, but now there was something that threatened to unravel it all. "What are you saying?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but sharp, like a taut string waiting to snap. "Tell me everything." "The medical examiner believes that Lydia's death wasn't caused by the knife wound alone," the constable continued, his face drawn. "There are signs of poisoning in her system, something that wasn't present when Clara confessed to the stabbing. The wound could have been fatal, but there's no indication it was the only cause of death." Miss Marple's mind spun. Poisoning. The thought hadn't even crossed her mind. Lydia's body had been found with a clear wound, but poisoning. That was a complication she hadn't anticipated. It made everything more complicated. The confession now seemed more suspect. Was Clara lying about the stabbing? Or had there been something else involved altogether? "I need to see the full report," Miss Marple said, her voice now sharp with determination. The constable nodded, pulling out a folded piece of paper from his jacket and handing it to her. Miss Marple scanned the details quickly. The signs were there. Trace amounts of poison in Lydia's system, not a large dose, but enough to contribute to her demise. As she absorbed the information, a faint memory tugged at the back of her mind. Something she had overlooked earlier. The bottle of wine. The odd way Lydia had been drinking that night. Could it have been poisoned without anyone noticing? "No, this doesn't make sense," Miss Marple muttered to herself. The pieces were slipping into place, but not in the way she had expected. There was more to this story. A new, more dangerous layer had been added to the case. Clara's confession wasn't just flawed, it was incomplete. "Thank you, Constable," Miss Marple said as she folded the report and handed it back to him. Her mind was already racing through the new information. She turned quickly, almost instinctively, and made her way back into the drawing room where Clara and Henry were still sitting in stunned silence. "Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice carrying an edge now, "there is something you haven't told me. Something you didn't confess." Clara, who had been hunched over, looking like she might collapse again at any moment, lifted her head. Her eyes were still red-rimmed from tears, but now they were sharp with fear. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice a hushed whisper. "The medical examiner has found something that changes everything," Miss Marple continued, her eyes locking onto Clara's. "Lydia didn't just die from a stab wound. There was poisoning in her system." "You didn't mention that, did you?" Clara froze. The colour drained from her face, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked to her brother for support, but Henry was silent. His face just as confused and horrified as hers. "What are you talking about?" Henry asked, his voice shaking. Clara confessed. She admitted to it all. Miss Marple gave him a quick, pointed look, as though warning him to remain calm. "Clara," she said again, her voice softening but still firm. "You didn't kill Lydia alone, did you?" Clara shook her head, looking like she might crumble under the weight of the question. I don't know what you mean," she stammered. "I didn't poison her. I didn't—" "No," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "but someone else did." There was a long pause as the room seemed to freeze in place. Clara's face twisted with confusion, but there was a flicker of realization in her eyes. Something that Miss Marple had been waiting for, the moment when the truth started to break through. You didn't do this alone, Clara, Miss Marple said, her gaze never leaving Clara's. Someone close to you had a hand in it, and I think you know who that is. Clara's mouth went dry as she swallowed, her face flushing with a mixture of dread and guilt. No, I didn't, she started, but her voice trailed off. Miss Marple stood up straighter now, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with startling clarity. The final twist had arrived. You didn't want anyone to know about the affair, Miss Marple continued, her voice low and steady. Not just Lydia, but someone else. Someone who had more to gain from Lydia's death than you did. Clara's eyes widened. She had known deep down that this moment would come. The last undeniable truth would finally emerge. Clara's face had gone ashen, the last thread of her composure slipping away. Her eyes darted between Miss Marple and Henry, who was still frozen, his eyes wide with an unspoken terror. She couldn't hide the truth any longer. It was written all over her face. The fear, the guilt, the desperation to keep her brother from learning the full extent of the betrayal. "You're right," Clara whispered, barely audible. Her voice cracked, and she sank into a chair, her hands shaking. "I didn't kill Lydia on my own. I didn't want to, but he made me do it." Henry, who had been slowly coming to terms with the revelation of his sister's confession, now looked at her with an expression of disbelief, struggling to piece together the full picture. "What are you saying, Clara?" Henry's voice broke, full of confusion and hurt. "Who else was involved? You confessed to the murder. You said—" Clara held up her trembling hand, silencing him before he could finish. She turned to Miss Marple, her eyes pleading for understanding. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said in a strangled whisper. I was already in too deep. He convinced me it was the only way. I thought—" Her voice faltered again, and she closed her eyes as if she were trying to find the right words to make everything clearer. He was the one who poisoned her, and he was the one who made me stab her. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to. But he promised me it would all be over if we just did it. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, absorbing Clara's confession, with a quiet intensity. She already knew who Clara was talking about, the hidden figure that had remained in the shadows, elusive and dangerous. But now, with Clara's admission, the final puzzle piece had fallen into place. Henry still hadn't processed the truth. He was looking at his sister with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. He took a step forward, his voice trembling as he struggled to grasp the enormity of what she had just admitted. "You're telling me that Andrew was involved?" Henry asked, his voice rising with shock. Clara's face crumpled as she nodded, tears spilling over her cheeks. "Yes, he helped me. He knew about Lydia and how she was getting too close. He said if we got rid of her, no one would question anything. No one would know the truth. And he was right. Everyone believed it was just me. But it was never just me," Henry stumbled backward, his face contorting in disbelief. "Andrew? But he's our cousin. I know, Henry!" Clara shouted, her voice cracking. "I know. I didn't want it to happen." "I swear I didn't. But he promised me it would be quick, and no one would get hurt. I didn't think—" "And what about the poisoning?" Miss Marple's voice interrupted sharply. She was calm, but her words had the weight of a closing door. "The poison was subtle, Clara. Not something one could easily detect. Not a common method. It had to be someone with knowledge of chemicals, someone who could handle such a thing without leaving obvious traces. And that person, it was Andrew, Clara finished for her, her voice broken. I didn't know he was capable of that. He always seemed so calm, so kind. But when it came to Lydia, he changed. He said we had to move quickly before she ruined everything. The room fell silent as Henry absorbed the weight of his sister's confession. Miss Marple's mind, however, was already in motion, sifting through the final details of the case. Andrew had always been a peripheral figure, a shadow who had remained far enough away to avoid suspicion. But now, with Clara's words, the true extent of his involvement was clear. Did Andrew know about the investigation? Miss Marple asked quietly, her eyes narrowing as she watched Clara. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her voice raw. Yes. He knew about everything. He knew that Lydia was going to tell someone, and he couldn't have that. He thought I was the only one who could help him. He promised me everything would be fine. But it wasn't. Miss Marple's gaze flicked to Henry, who was now pacing the floor, his mind spinning. He stopped suddenly and looked up at Miss Marple, a bitter realization dawning on him. So, Andrew has been behind this the whole time? He asked, his voice cold with anger. He's the one who made all the plans? And now, he's just going to get away with it? Miss Marple's expression softened. Not if I can help it, she said firmly. Her mind was already working through the next steps. Andrew had managed to stay out of the spotlight, but he was not beyond reach. There were still threads to pull, lies to untangle, and truths to expose. With Clara's confession and the evidence they had, the case was no longer just about Lydia's death. It was about Andrew's calculated manipulation, his cunning deception, and his willingness to go to any lengths to cover his tracks. Miss Marple turned to the constable who had been quietly watching the exchange. "You must send for Andrew immediately," she said, her voice commanding. "He may have been clever, but he made one fatal mistake. He underestimated me." The constable nodded, and within moments he was out the door, already on his way to track. "Down, Andrew." Miss Marple took a deep breath and turned to Clara. "You've made a grave mistake, Clara," she said softly. "But you've also made the first step toward atonement. The truth is out now, and justice will be done." As Clara sat silently, her face pale with exhaustion and regret, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a small pang of sympathy for her. She was a victim, too, of manipulation, of deceit, of her own desperation to escape the consequences of a life built on lies. But in the end, the truth always found a way to come to light. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room thickened. The constable returned, this time with an expression of dread on his face. "We've searched the entire house," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Andrew's gone. There's no sign of him. He's disappeared." Miss Marple's heart sank. She had known in the back of her mind that Andrew would not be easy to catch. He had been too careful, too calculating, and now, with the case nearly solved, the final twist had arrived. "You said he underestimated me," Henry said quietly, his voice bitter. "But it looks like he's already gotten away." Miss Marple nodded, slowly, her eyes distant. "Yes," she said softly. "It seems justice will have to wait for now. But rest assured, Henry, justice always catches up in the end. It's only a matter of time." As the room fell into a heavy silence, The detective knew that this chapter was far from over. The trail would grow cold for a while, but the pattern was now clear. Andrew's time would come. He would not escape forever. Justice, it seemed, had been delayed but not defeated. The final confrontation had not come to pass just yet, and Miss Marple knew, deep down, that this was far from the end of the story. The sun was beginning to set as Miss Marple made her way down the quiet country lane, her thoughts still circling around the events of the past days. Clara's confession, the surprising disappearance of Andrew, and the tangled web of deception they had unravelled. It was all coming together, but there was something, just something, that nagged at the back of her mind. As she passed by the ivy-clad walls of the old church, she paused, her gaze drawn to a weathered stone marker near the entrance. The initials inscribed on it, a name she'd seen once before, made her pause longer. It was faint now, nearly erased by years of wear, but she could just make out the letters. E.W. She had seen them earlier that week, etched into a forgotten letter, but she hadn't thought much of it at the time. Yet now, with everything she had learned, with all the pieces clicking into place, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence. Miss Marple's steps faltered. She'd long believed that the most subtle of clues were often the most telling, and now that seemingly insignificant detail, the name on the marker, seemed to reverberate in her thoughts like a bell tolling at midnight. What had she missed? The constable had told her about the search for Andrew, and he was right. Andrew had vanished. His escape had been swift, his departure clean. But the more Miss Marple thought about it, the less she believed it was just a coincidence. Andrew, after all, was a master at evading suspicion, always a step ahead, hiding his true nature behind charm and cold precision. The entire case had been orchestrated with such careful detail that it was almost too neat. And now, with his sudden disappearance, the conclusion felt incomplete. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the letter, the one that had been left for Lydia just before her death, the one with the cryptic phrases, the ominous promises. It had seemed like a harmless clue at the time, another piece of the puzzle that had fit into place without any real mystery left, but now it felt like more. She had yet to speak of it to anyone. No one else seemed to have noticed the odd phrasing or the strange connection to a name she'd seen mentioned in Lydia's journal. But that E.W. had remained, nagging at her like an itch she couldn't scratch. A sharp breeze blew past, and Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way home. She paused at the gate to her garden, noticing the evening shadows had already stretched long across the path. In her heart, she knew she wasn't finished with this case, not by a long shot. Her thoughts flickered back to the final confrontation, with Clara, the way her sister had crumbled under the weight of her confession. Clara had given them much, but in the end, she'd only scratched the surface of a much darker, deeper mystery. Andrew's manipulation, his deceit, everything had led to this point. But there were threads Miss Marple had yet to tie together. At her doorstep, Miss Marple stopped for a moment, her hand resting on the latch. She gazed down at the stone pathway, leading up to her little cottage, and found her mind wandering again, this time toward the part of the investigation that had seemed so insignificant in comparison, the locked drawer in Lydia's desk, the one she'd barely noticed at first glance. At the time, she'd assumed it was just another locked box in a house filled with secrets, but now she wondered, what was inside it that Lydia had felt the need to hide? The sound of her kettle boiling from inside brought her back to the present. There would be time to think about all of this later. For now, a cup of tea would be a comfort. She was, after all, well known for her calm demeanour and her careful thinking, qualities that had served her well through every case she'd tackled over the years. But as she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was still something left to uncover. As she settled into her chair, Miss Marple allowed herself a brief moment of peace, savouring the warm tea between her hands. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the embers glowing as if in some silent agreement. Her eyes rested on the stack of papers on her desk, the last remnants of the case that had consumed her every waking thought. She would sort through them tomorrow. For tonight, she could relax. But the nagging sensation lingered, whispering in the back of her mind as if the mystery wasn't quite over yet. The kettle's whistle died down, but Miss Marple's mind remained alert. She didn't have all the answers. Not yet. But she would find them. And then, like a thief in the night, the sound of a faint knock came from the door. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple's sharp ears caught it immediately. Her gaze flicked to the clock. Late. Much too late for a visitor. A quiet sense of unease crept over her. There was only one person who would come to her door at this hour, and she had no idea what he wanted now. Taking a deep breath, Miss Marple stood, her senses tingling as she approached the door. When she opened it, she found no one there. Just as she was about to close it again, something caught her eye. A small envelope, its edges yellowed and crinkled, was tucked between the door and the frame. It was unmarked, its contents invisible, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. E.W. She felt the hairs on her neck prickle. This was no coincidence. The mystery was far from over. And with a slow, deliberate hand, Miss Marple reached for the envelope. It was then, in the quiet of her cottage, with the winds howling outside, that she realized the true mastermind had not been caught. The pieces of the puzzle she thought she had solved had merely been a diversion. The game was far from finished. She smiled faintly to herself, her eyes twinkling with determination. This was not the end. It was only the beginning.